The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Ridgeline Shooting Range as Eleanor Blackwood pulled her old blue Buick into a spot near the entrance. She sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, gathering her courage. It had been nearly 5 years since she'd last been to a shooting range. 5 years since Robert had passed away after 42 years of marriage. 5 years of quiet dinners alone and too much time to think. Eleanor glanced at the worn leather case sitting on the passenger seat. Inside was Robert's .38 Special, a retirement gift from his 30 years in law enforcement. The gun had been sitting in her bedroom drawer since the funeral, untouched until yesterday when something in her had finally said, "Enough waiting." "Well, I suppose it's now or never," she whispered to herself, her voice sounding too loud in the quiet car. At 73, Eleanor moved more slowly than she used to. Her knees protested as she stepped out of the car, and her fingers, slightly bent from arthritis, fumbled with the door handle of the shooting range. The heavy glass door was unexpectedly difficult to pull open, and she had to use both hands. Inside, the air smelled of gunpowder and coffee. The familiar scent brought back a flood of memories. Weekend mornings spent with Robert, the friendly competitions they'd had, the way he'd always kiss her cheek when she outshot him, which was more often than not. Eleanor had been one of the first female shooting instructors at the FBI Academy in Quantico, though that part of her life seemed like it belonged to someone else now. The young man behind the counter barely looked up from his phone when the door chimed. Eleanor approached slowly, taking in the changes to the range. New electronic targets had replaced the old paper ones she remembered. The walls had been painted a dark gray instead of the beige she recalled. Posters advertising the latest firearms covered the walls where there had once been safety rules and old photographs. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, finally glancing up. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Eleanor, with her silver hair, pulled back in a simple bun and her cardigan buttoned neatly over a plain blouse. "Yes, I'd like a lane, please," Eleanor said, setting her purse and the leather gun case on the counter. The clerk, his name tag read Tyler, looked from Eleanor to the gun case and back. Are you sure you're in the right place, ma'am? The senior center is just down the block." Eleanor smiled politely. "I'm quite sure. 1 lane, please." For an hour. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor noticed a group of young men standing near the entrance to the range itself. They wore matching tactical vests and had an assortment of expensive-looking firearms laid out on a table. One of them, a man with a sleeve of colorful tattoos covering his left arm and a baseball cap worn backward, nudged his friend and nodded in Eleanor's direction. "Think Grandma's lost?" he said loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. "Or maybe she's here to knit us all some bulletproof sweaters." His friends laughed, not bothering to keep their voices down. Eleanor kept her eyes on Tyler, pretending not to hear. "That'll be $35, Tyler said, sliding a waiver form toward her. "You'll need to fill this out. Do you have your own eye and ear protection?" "I do," Eleanor said, though in truth she only had Robert's old earmuffs. Her hand trembled slightly as she filled out the form, a combination of age and the nervousness of returning to something that had once been such a big part of her life. "Hey, Frank," the tattooed man called out to another clerk. "Maybe we should have a senior discount. What do you think?" More laughter. Eleanor continued writing, her cursive neat despite her shaking hands. "You'll be in lane 7, Tyler said, taking the completed form. "Just through those doors and to the right." "Thank you," Eleanor said, gathering her belongings. As she made her way to the doors leading to the actual range, she had to pass by the group of young men. There were 5 of them, all probably in their late 20s or early 30s. They fell silent as she approached, but she could feel their eyes on her, judging, dismissing. "Excuse me," she said softly, needing to get by where one of them was leaning against the wall. The man, tall with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive-looking shooting glasses perched on top of his head, stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "After you, ma'am. Careful now, wouldn't want you to trip." Eleanor nodded politely and continued through the doors. The range itself was louder than she remembered. The crack of gunfire echoed off the walls despite the sound-dampening panels. Most of the lanes were occupied by serious-looking shooters, men and women focused on their targets. Lane 7 was at the far end. Eleanor set her case down on the small table and took a deep breath. The familiar routine came back to her as she unpacked. Check the surroundings, set up the station, prepare the firearm, put on protection. She could almost hear Robert's voice coaching her through the steps as he had when they first met. Before, she'd quickly surpassed his skill level. The leather case creaked as she opened it. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, was the .38 Special. It looked exactly as it had the last time Robert had used it. Eleanor ran a finger along the barrel, remembering the countless times she'd seen it in her husband's capable hands. I hope you've been taking good care of that antique. Eleanor looked up to see the tattooed man standing at the entrance to her lane, arms crossed over his chest. His friends were setting up a few lanes down, but he'd apparently decided to come over for a closer look. It's been well maintained, Eleanor replied, not taking the bait. My grandpa had one just like it, the young man said. Piece of history, that is. Not much use for actual shooting these days, though. Too much kick for old hands, if you know what I mean. He made a gesture mimicking recoil, then grinned at her. Eleanor smiled thinly. I think I'll manage. Name's Dustin, by the way, he said, not taking the hint to leave. Me and the guys come here every Saturday. We're part of a tactical shooting club. He gestured toward his friends who were now loading what looked like custom AR-15s. You sure you wouldn't be more comfortable watching? We could show you how it's done in the 21st century. That's very kind, Eleanor said, but I'm here to shoot. Dustin shrugged. Suit yourself. Just don't hurt yourself with that fossil. He rejoined his friends, and Eleanor could hear them laughing again. She turned back to her preparations. The .38 felt heavier than she remembered as she lifted it, but her grip was still sure. She checked the cylinder, empty as it should be. From her purse, she took out a small box of ammunition that she'd purchased the day before. Her fingers worked slowly but methodically as she loaded the gun. From a few lanes down, Eleanor could hear Dustin and his friends showing off, firing rapid sequences at their targets. They were good, she had to admit. Quick and mostly accurate, though she could tell from the sound that at least one of them was jerking the trigger instead of squeezing it smoothly. A range safety officer appeared at her lane, a middle-aged man, with kind eyes and a neat mustache. His name badge read Jim. Everything all right here, ma'am? He asked, his eyes taking in her setup. Yes, thank you, Eleanor replied. Jim glanced at the gun in her hands. That's a classic piece. You familiar with how to handle it? There was genuine concern in his voice, not mockery, and Eleanor appreciated that. Yes, I am. My husband and I used to come here quite often years ago. Well, just wanted to check. Let me know if you need anything. He gave her a friendly nod and moved on to the next lane. Eleanor put on Robert's old earmuffs. They were too big for her, but they would do. She didn't have proper shooting glasses, so she put on her reading glasses instead. From the corner of her eye, she could see Dustin pointing her out to his friends again, miming her awkward movements with the earmuffs. One of them took out his phone, probably to record her for their amusement. Eleanor ignored them. She pressed the button to send the target out to 20 feet, a distance she'd once considered a warm-up but now seemed right for her first time back. The paper target fluttered slightly in the air currents as it moved away from her. Her heart was beating, quickly now, partly from nerves, partly from a long-forgotten excitement. Eleanor raised the revolver, holding it in both hands the way she'd been taught and had taught others for so many years. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the gun, the cool grip against her palm. For just a moment, she thought of backing out, of putting the gun away and going home to her quiet house and her routine. It had been so long, after all. Her eyes weren't what they used to be. Her hands certainly weren't as steady. But then she thought of Robert, and how disappointed he would be if she gave up because some young men thought she didn't belong. She thought of all the female agents she'd trained, who had faced much worse than a few snide comments. Eleanor squared her shoulders, aligned her stance, and focused on the target. The noises of the range, the gunfire, the laughter, all of it, faded away. There was only her, the gun, and the target. She squeezed the trigger. The first shot rang out, echoing through the range despite the ear protection everyone wore. Eleanor felt the familiar kick of the revolver, the way it pushed back against her palms. It had been years, but her body remembered the feeling. Her shoulders absorbed the recoil just as they had thousands of times before. She lowered the gun slightly and looked at the target. The hole was slightly off-center, not her best, but not bad for someone who hadn't fired a gun in 5 years. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile before raising the revolver again. Down the range, Dustin and his friends had paused their own shooting to watch her. She could feel their eyes, on her back, probably waiting for her to flinch or drop the gun. Eleanor pushed the thought away and focused on her breathing. Inhale, hold, squeeze gently. Exhale. The second shot was better than the first, the third better still. By the fourth, her hands had stopped trembling altogether. By the sixth and final shot in the cylinder, she was hitting close to dead center. Eleanor set the revolver down carefully on the table, pointed downrange, and began the process of reloading. From the corner of her eye, she could see Dustin whispering something to his friends. One of them, a shorter man with expensive-looking boots, laughed loudly. "Not bad for a first try, Grandma," Dustin called out. "Beginner's luck, though. Let's see you do it again." Eleanor didn't respond. She finished loading the cylinder and closed it with a practiced flick of her wrist. She could hear the group of young men shuffling closer, no longer bothering with their own shooting. They wanted to watch the show. The range safety officer, Jim, had noticed too. He was standing a few lanes down, keeping an eye on the situation. Eleanor gave him a small nod to show she was fine. She didn't need rescuing from a few rude young men. She raised the revolver again, this time holding it with just her right hand, the way she'd done in competitions decades ago. It was heavier than she remembered and her arm wasn't as strong, but she could manage. She squeezed the trigger slowly, feeling the resistance build until the gun fired. The shot hit dead center. Someone behind her whistled low. "Luck," said one of Dustin's friends, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and an expensive watch that caught the light as he gestured. "Has to be luck." Eleanor fired again, and again, each shot landing in a tight cluster around the center of the target. When she finished the second cylinder, she pressed the button to bring the target forward. There was a perfect pattern of holes in the center mass. Not her best grouping, but respectable. Very respectable for someone her age who hadn't shot in years. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Dustin standing at the edge of her lane, his cocky smile replaced by a look of confusion. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. Eleanor set the revolver down and turned to face him fully. "My husband taught me the basics," she said. "A long time ago." It wasn't exactly a lie. Robert had introduced her to shooting when they first met at a law enforcement picnic, but within 6 months she had far surpassed his skill level. By the time they married a year later, she was already being recruited to teach at Quantico. "Your husband must have been quite the shooter," said another of the young men who had joined Dustin. This one had a military-style haircut and stood with the straight posture of someone who had served. "He was good," Eleanor acknowledged. "He was a police officer for 30 years. "Was?" asked the man with the military haircut. "He passed away 5 years ago." The men at least had the decency to look uncomfortable at this. "Sorry to hear that," Dustin mumbled. "Thank you," Eleanor said. She turned back to her station, hoping they would take the hint and leave her to her practice. They didn't. "So what? Are you doing here all by yourself?" asked the man with the expensive boots. "Most people your age?" "Well, they're not usually into shooting." "And what age would that be?" Eleanor asked mildly, not looking up as she began to reload the revolver again. "You know, senior citizen and all that," the man said with an awkward laugh. "No offense." "None taken," Eleanor said, though the comment stung more than she cared to admit. "I'm 73 if you're wondering, and I'm here because I used to enjoy shooting very much. I thought it was time to see if I still did." "And do you?" asked the man with the military haircut. There seemed to be genuine curiosity in his voice. Eleanor considered the question as she finished loading. Yes, she said finally. I believe I do. She turned toward the target again, but before she could raise her gun, Dustin spoke up. That's a nice antique you've got there, he said, nodding at the .38 Special. But you should try something with a bit more modern technology. He held out his own gun, a sleek, black semi-automatic with all sorts of attachments. This beauty has almost no recoil and the sight is laser-guided. Way easier on old hands. Eleanor looked at the offered gun and shook her head. No, thank you. I prefer what I'm used to. Come on, Dustin insisted. Just give it a try. I bet you'll hit even better with this. I appreciate the offer, but no, Eleanor said more firmly. What's the matter? Asked the man with the expensive boots. Afraid of new things? Eleanor sighed. These young men simply wouldn't leave her alone. Perhaps the quickest way to get back to her peaceful practice was to humor them. Very well, she said, setting down her revolver. I'll try it once. Dustin grinned triumphantly and handed her his gun. It was lighter than she expected and oddly balanced with all the attachments. Eleanor examined it carefully, finding the safety and checking that it was engaged. You know how to use it? Dustin asked, suddenly concerned that he was handing his expensive firearm to an elderly woman who might not know what she was doing. I believe I can figure it out, Eleanor said dryly. She pressed the button to send a fresh target out, then took her stance. The other young men had gathered around now, watching with undisguised curiosity. Even a few other shooters from nearby lanes had paused to observe. Eleanor disengaged the safety, raised the gun, and fired. The recoil was indeed much lighter than her revolver, but the trigger pull was different, too light for her taste. The shot hit just off center. See? Dustin said. Much easier, right? Eleanor didn't answer. She adjusted her grip slightly and fired again, getting a feel for the unfamiliar weapon. The second shot was closer to center. By the third, she had adjusted completely and hit dead center. She fired the remaining rounds in the magazine in quick succession, each one hitting within the smallest ring on the target. When she finished, she engaged the safety and handed the gun back to Dustin, whose mouth was hanging slightly open. Not bad, she said. But I still prefer my revolver. The range had fallen oddly quiet. Even the shooters at the far end seemed to have paused. Eleanor turned to see what everyone was looking at and found Jim, the safety officer, standing just behind her group of observers. Mrs. Blackwood, Jim said. I thought it was you, but I wasn't sure until I saw you shoot. Eleanor tilted her head, trying to place him. Had they met before? You don't remember me, Jim said with a small smile. But I remember you. You taught a 2-week course at Quantico in '85. I was just a rookie then. The memories came flooding back. The bright classroom, the eager young faces, the weight of being one of the only female instructors. You're Jim Taylor, Eleanor said, slowly, the pieces falling into place. You had trouble with your stance, kept leaning too far forward. Jim's face lit up. You do remember. I can't believe it. You were the best instructor I ever had. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the praise. That's very kind of you to say. Wait, Dustin interrupted, looking between them. You were an instructor? Like for the police? FBI, actually, Jim answered before Eleanor could. Mrs. Blackwood here was one of the first female firearms instructors at Quantico. Set records that stood for years. The group of young men fell, silent, looking at Eleanor with new eyes. She felt suddenly self-conscious under their stares. It was a long time ago, she said quietly. Is that why you're so good? Asked the man with the military haircut. You were a professional? Eleanor nodded. I was, for almost 30 years. Well, I'll be damned, said the man with the expensive boots, shaking his head. We've been making fools of ourselves, haven't we? You certainly have, Pete, Jim agreed. Mrs. Blackwood probably forgot more about shooting than you'll ever know. Pete had the good grace to look embarrassed. Sorry about that, ma'am. We didn't mean any disrespect. Yeah, Dustin added. We were just, surprised to see someone like you here. Someone like me? Eleanor asked, raising an eyebrow. He means someone distinguished, the man with the military haircut said quickly. Right, Dustin? Dustin nodded vigorously. Exactly. Distinguished. Eleanor couldn't help but smile at their awkward attempts to backpedal. Well, I'm here now, and I'd like to finish my practice if you don't mind. Of course, Dustin said, backing away. We'll leave you to it. But before they could retreat to their own lanes, Jim spoke up. Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, would you mind showing these boys a thing or two? Might do them good to learn from the best. Eleanor hesitated. She had come here for a quiet practice session, a private reconnection with a part of her past. The last thing she had expected was to become an impromptu instructor, but looking at the young men's faces, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity and a hint of respect, she felt something stir inside her, something that had been dormant for too long. I suppose I could show them a few basics, she said finally. If they're interested in learning. Are you kidding? Dustin said. That would be awesome. The others nodded eagerly, and Eleanor found herself surrounded by the very men who had been laughing at her just minutes ago. As she began to explain the proper grip for a revolver, she caught Jim's eye. He gave her a knowing smile, and she realized that perhaps this was exactly what she had been missing all these years. Not just the shooting, but the teaching, the sharing of knowledge. For the first time since Robert died, Eleanor felt truly alive again. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the shooting range, casting long rectangles of light across the floor. Eleanor's throat was dry from talking, but she hadn't felt this energized in years. The group of young men who had mocked her earlier now clustered around her like eager students, hanging on her every word. The most common mistake I see, Eleanor said, demonstrating with her unloaded revolver, is trying to use too much finger on the trigger. You want just the pad of your index finger, right here. She showed them the proper placement. Too much finger and you'll pull the shot to the left. Too little and you'll push it right. Dustin nodded seriously, a far cry from his sneering attitude earlier. I think that's what I've been doing wrong. I've been wrapping too much finger around it. Easy mistake to make, Eleanor assured him. Now, let me see you try. Dustin picked up his expensive semi-automatic and assumed the stance Eleanor had taught them. His posture was much improved, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, shoulders relaxed but firm. He raised the gun, focused on the target, and fired 3 shots in quick succession. Better, Eleanor said, genuine pride in her voice. Much better. Look at your grouping. Much tighter than before. Dustin grinned, looking like a schoolboy who'd just been praised by his favorite teacher. Thanks to you, he said. I've been shooting for 5 years and no one ever pointed out my trigger finger problem. Most people focus too much on the fancy equipment, Eleanor said, glancing meaningfully at all the attachments on his gun. They forget that the basics matter most. Mrs. Blackwood, said Pete, the man with the expensive boots who had been so dismissive earlier. Can you show us that one-handed stance again? The one you used for competition? Eleanor nodded, though her arm had started to ache from the unaccustomed exertion. The Weaver stance was standard when I competed, she explained, demonstrating the position, right arm nearly straight but not locked, left hand supporting the right wrist. She raised her revolver, showing them how it was done. But for one-handed shooting, especially with a revolver, you want a modified isosceles. She shifted her stance slightly and extended her right arm, holding the revolver steady with just one hand. Her arm wasn't as strong as it once was, and she could feel a slight tremor in her muscles, but she kept the gun level. Keep your arm straight, but not rigid, she said, and balance is key. Feel how your weight is distributed evenly between both feet. The young men nodded, watching intently. Now the trick with one-handed shooting is controlling your breathing. Inhale, she demonstrated, taking a deep breath. Hold at the top of the breath. She paused, and then squeeze gently as you exhale slowly. She fired, and despite her tired arm, the shot hit near center of the target. Damn, whispered the man with the military haircut, who had introduced himself as Kevin. That's impressive. Eleanor lowered her arm, trying not to show how tired she felt. It's just practice, she said modestly. Years and years of practice. How long did you teach at Quantico? Asked Dustin. Nearly 30 years, Eleanor replied, setting her revolver down and flexing her fingers to work out the stiffness. I started in 1976 and retired in 2005. You must have seen a lot of changes, Kevin said. In the FBI, I mean. Eleanor smiled, remembering. When I started, there were hardly any women in the firearms division. The men used to place bets on whether I'd wash out in the first week. But you showed them, Pete said with a grin. I did, Eleanor agreed. Though it wasn't easy. My first day, someone had filled my locker with dish soap and an apron. The young men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sorry about earlier, Dustin said, rubbing the back of his neck. We were being jerks. Yes, you were, Eleanor agreed matter-of-factly. But you're learning, that's what matters. Jim, the range safety officer, had been watching from a distance, letting Eleanor work her magic with the young shooters. Now he approached, a soft smile on his face. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, we're about to close up for lunch, but I'd be honored if you'd join us, me and the boys here at the diner next door. My treat. Eleanor hesitated. This wasn't what she had planned for today. She'd expected to come to the range, spend a quiet hour reconnecting with a part of her past, and then go home to her empty house and her usual routine. Lunch with a group of strangers hadn't been part of the equation. But then again, nothing about this day had gone as expected. I'd like that, she said finally. 20 minutes later, they were seated around a large table at Molly's Diner, a small restaurant attached to the strip mall that housed the shooting range. The place was nothing fancy. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, and the lingering smell of breakfast despite it being well past noon. But it was clean and bright, and the waitress knew Jim by name. The usual Jim? She asked, a coffee pot already in hand. You know it, Linda, Jim replied with a smile. And whatever these folks want, it's all on one check today. Eleanor ordered a club sandwich and coffee. The young men, apparently starving after their morning at the range, ordered burgers, fries, and milkshakes. As they waited for their food, the conversation flowed surprisingly easily. So what made you decide to come back to the range after all this time? Kevin asked Eleanor. Eleanor took a sip of her water, considering the question. I'm not entirely sure, she said honestly. I woke up yesterday and looked at my husband's gun case gathering dust, and something just clicked. I decided it was time. I'm glad you did, Dustin said. We learned more in an hour with you than in months of practicing on our own. That's kind of you to say, Eleanor replied. It's true, Pete insisted. Most instructors just tell you what to do. You explain why, and that makes all the difference. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee Linda had just poured. That was always my teaching philosophy. Anyone can memorize steps, but understanding the reasoning helps you adapt and improve. Mrs. Blackwood, Jim said, leaning forward slightly. I hope this isn't too forward, but the range has been looking for a part-time instructor. Nothing too demanding, maybe a few hours on weekends. Would you possibly be interested? The question caught Eleanor off guard. Me? But I've been retired for years, and I'm hardly in competition shape anymore. That doesn't matter, Jim said. Your knowledge, your experience, that's what we need. Half the people who come into the range these days don't know the first thing about proper gun handling. They've played video games and think that qualifies them. He's not wrong, Kevin admitted. I was one of those people when I started. At least you had military training, Dustin said. I learned from YouTube videos. Eleanor raised her eyebrows. That explains a lot. The table erupted in laughter, and Eleanor found herself joining in. When was the last time she had laughed? Like this? Truly laughed. Not just the polite chuckle she used when her neighbor told a poor joke or when the checkout clerk at the grocery store tried to make small talk. So what do you say? Jim asked when the laughter died down. Would you consider it? The pay isn't much, but it's not about the money, Eleanor interrupted gently. I don't know if I'm the right person for the job anymore. You're exactly the right person, Pete said firmly. Look how much you taught us in just an hour. And it would be a way to honor Robert's memory, Jim added softly. Passing on what you both love to a new generation. Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of her husband's name. Robert would have loved this. The teaching, the camaraderie, the respect these young men were showing her now. He had always been her biggest supporter, always told her she was at her best when she was teaching. Their food arrived, temporarily halting the conversation. Eleanor picked at her sandwich, her mind racing. Was she really considering this? Coming out of retirement to teach shooting again? At 73? You don't have to decide right now, Jim said, seeming to sense her uncertainty. Think about it. The offer's open whenever you're ready. Eleanor nodded gratefully and turned the conversation to other topics. She learned that Dustin worked as a graphic designer, that Pete was a real estate agent, and that Kevin had served 4 years in the Army before becoming a physical therapist. They were all different from what she had initially assumed, not just arrogant young men with expensive toys, but people with lives and stories of their own. As lunch went on, Eleanor found herself enjoying their company more and more. They asked about her career, about the changes she'd seen in firearms training over the decades, about the most challenging students she'd ever taught. There was this one agent, she told them, smiling at the memory. Brilliant investigator, but he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. No matter what I tried, he just couldn't get the hang of it. What happened to him? Dustin asked, leaning forward eagerly. He eventually passed the firearms qualification. Barely, Eleanor said. Last I heard, he was a senior analyst at headquarters. Probably never fired his service weapon outside of the required range time. You must have some amazing stories, Pete said. 30 years with the FBI. You should write a book or something. Eleanor laughed. Who would read it? An old woman's memories of teaching people to shoot? I would, Dustin said immediately. Me too, Kevin agreed. I think you underestimate how interesting your life has been, Mrs. Blackwood, Jim said gently. Eleanor felt a strange mix of emotions, pride, nostalgia, and something else she couldn't quite name. For so long she had been living in the shadows of her memories, convinced that her useful days were behind her. But sitting here, surrounded by these people who valued what she knew, what she could teach them, she felt a spark of something new, a possibility. As they finished their meal and prepared to leave, Jim handed Eleanor a business card with the range's information. Think about it, he said again. We'd be lucky to have you. Eleanor slipped the card into her purse. I will, she promised. And for the first time in a very long time, she was actually looking forward to what might come next. Eleanor's house felt different when she returned home that afternoon. The same furniture sat in the same places. The same photos hung on the walls. The same silence filled the rooms. But something had changed. Not in the house, but in her. She set her purse and Robert's gun case on the kitchen table and stood for a moment, listening to the quiet tick of the wall clock. For 5 years that sound had been her constant companion, marking the slow passage of empty hours. Today it seemed faster somehow, more purposeful. Eleanor made herself a cup of tea and carried it to the living room. She settled into her favorite armchair, the one with the view of the backyard where birds visited the feeder she kept filled year-round. A cardinal landed on the feeder, its bright red feathers standing out against the green of the yard. Eleanor watched it, sipping her tea, her mind replaying the events of the morning. The shooting range, the young men who had mocked her, the surprise on their faces when they discovered who she was, lunch at the diner, and Jim's offer. Eleanor pulled the business card from her purse and turned it over in her fingers. Ridgeline Shooting Range. Jim, Taylor, range manager. A phone number and email address. Such a small thing, this rectangle of cardstock, but it represented something huge, a possible new chapter in her life when she thought all her chapters were written. She set the card on the side table and leaned back, closing her eyes. What would Robert say if he were here? She could almost hear his voice, warm and encouraging as always. Go for it, Ellie, he would say. You've still got so much to give. But did she? She was 73 years old. Her hands weren't as steady as they once were. Her eyes weren't as sharp. Her stamina wasn't what it had been when she was teaching at Quantico. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Eleanor reached for it, expecting her daughter calling for their weekly check-in. "Hello? Mrs. Blackwood, it's Dustin from the range this morning." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Dustin? How did you get my number?" "Jim gave it to me." "I hope that's okay." He sounded nervous. "I wanted to ask you something and I didn't get a chance before you left." Eleanor settled back in her chair. "What is it?" "Well, me and the guys, Pete and Kevin and a couple others from our club, we meet every Saturday morning at the range. But we've been talking, and well, we'd like to hire you for some private lessons, if you're interested." The request took Eleanor by surprise. "Private lessons? But surely there are qualified instructors at the range already." "There are," Dustin acknowledged, "but they're not you. The things you showed us today." It was like everything suddenly clicked. Kevin said he learned more in an hour with you than in 4 years in the Army. Eleanor felt a flutter of pride at the compliment. "That's very kind, but..." "We'll pay whatever your rate is," Dustin rushed on. "And we can work around your schedule. It doesn't have to be every week if that's too much. Maybe just once a month, or whatever works for you." Eleanor gazed out the window at her backyard. The cardinal had been joined by its mate, both of them picking at the seeds in the feeder. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. "This isn't something I'd planned on doing." "Of course," Dustin said quickly. "Take all the time you need. But we'd really appreciate it if you'd consider it." After they hung up, Eleanor sat, for a long time, watching the birds come and go from the feeder as the afternoon light gradually shifted and softened. 2 offers in one day, after 5 years of nothing but routine and solitude. It felt like the universe was trying to tell her something. Eventually, she rose and walked to the hall closet. On the top shelf, tucked behind winter scarves and old photo albums, was a dusty box she hadn't opened since Robert's funeral. She pulled it down and carried it back to her chair. Inside were the mementos of her career, certificates of achievement, medals from shooting competitions, photos of her with various classes of FBI trainees, letters of commendation. And beneath it all, the custom holster Robert had given her for their 30th wedding anniversary, tooled with her initials and the FBI seal. Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth leather, remembering the pride in Robert's eyes when she'd opened it. "For the best shot I've ever known," he'd said. Her vision blurred with unexpected tears. She blinked them away and reached for a photo near the bottom of the box. A group shot from one of the last classes she'd taught before retirement. Young, faces serious and determined, looking toward the future. Where were they now? Still serving, retired? Had they passed on what she'd taught them to others? Eleanor's gaze moved to the phone. Instead of putting the box away, she picked up the receiver and dialed the number on Jim's card. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Ridgeline Range, Jim speaking." "Jim, it's Eleanor Blackwood." "Mrs. Blackwood." His voice warmed immediately. "I was hoping I'd hear from you." Eleanor took a deep breath. "About your offer. I'd like to know more details before I decide." "Of course," Jim said. "What would you like to know? What exactly would you expect from me? What would I be teaching?" "Basic firearms safety and marksmanship," Jim explained. "Nothing too strenuous. Saturday mornings, maybe 9 to noon. We get a lot of beginners then, people who've just bought their first gun and don't know which end is which. They could really benefit from your expertise." "And you think they'd listen to an old woman?" Eleanor asked, a hint of the morning's doubt creeping back into her voice. "After they see you shoot? Absolutely," Jim chuckled. "Besides, your credentials speak for themselves." Eleanor thought about it. 3 hours once a week. It wasn't a huge commitment, and if she didn't like it, she could always stop. "There's something else," she said. "Dustin called me. He and his friends want private lessons." "I'm not surprised," Jim replied. "They were mighty impressed with you, and between you and me, they could use the help. They've picked up some bad habits over the years." Eleanor smiled despite herself. "I noticed." So what do you think? Would you be willing to give it a try? Maybe come in this Saturday. See how it goes? No pressure. But I think you might enjoy it. Eleanor looked down at the photo in her lap, at all those young faces looking to her for guidance. Then she glanced at the wall where Robert's service photo hung, his eyes seeming to meet hers across time and space. Yes, she said finally, I'll give it a try. Wonderful. Jim's delight was evident even through the phone. I'll put you on the schedule. And Mrs. Blackwood? Thank you. This means a lot. After they hung up, Eleanor carefully packed away the box of memories, except for the holster which she set aside on the coffee table. Then she picked up Robert's gun case and carried it to the bedroom. Instead of returning it to the drawer where it had sat unused for 5 years, she placed it on the dresser in plain sight. A new chapter, indeed. The following Saturday morning dawned clear and cool. Eleanor woke earlier than usual, feeling an unfamiliar mix of nervousness and excitement. She dressed with care, choosing comfortable clothes that would allow her to move freely at the range. She made herself a hearty breakfast, something she rarely bothered with when eating alone, and packed the holster and Robert's .38 Special in a proper range bag she'd dug out of the hall closet. As she was about to leave, her phone rang. It was her daughter Lisa calling from Denver. Mom, you're up early, everything okay? Everything's fine, Eleanor assured her. I'm just heading out. Out? Where? Lisa sounded surprised, and Eleanor realized with a pang how unusual it was for her to have plans on a Saturday. To the shooting range, actually. There was a pause. The shooting range? Mom, are you serious? Perfectly serious, Eleanor replied. I've been hired as an instructor. Another longer pause. An instructor, Lisa repeated slowly. You're going to teach people to shoot. That's right. But gun, why? I mean, you haven't touched Dad's gun since he died. Eleanor sighed. How could she explain the events of the past week to her daughter? The mockery turned to respect, the feeling of purpose that had awoken in her. After so long dormant? It's something I'm good at, she said simply, and it turns out I've missed it. Well, if it makes you happy, Lisa said, though she still sounded doubtful. Just be careful, okay? I taught firearms safety for 30 years, dear, Eleanor reminded her gently. I think I'll be fine. After promising to call later with an update, Eleanor hung up and headed for her car. The drive to the range felt different this time. No nervousness, just a sense of rightness of heading where she was meant to be. A parking lot was already half full when she arrived. She recognized Dustin's car and a few spots down, Kevin's truck. The sight of them brought a smile to her face. Her first students, though they hadn't known it at the time. Jim met her at the door, a broad smile on his face. Mrs. Blackwood, right on time. Come on in, there are some people I'd like you to meet. He led her to a small classroom off the main range where about a dozen people sat in folding chairs. They were a diverse group, men and women, young and middle-aged, some looking confident, others visibly nervous. Everyone, Jim announced. This is Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood. She's going to be our new Saturday instructor. Mrs. Blackwood was an FBI firearms instructor at Quantico for nearly 30 years, so you're in very good hands. Eleanor surveyed the group, taking in their curious faces. For a moment, the familiar flutter of nervousness returned. It had been so long since she'd stood before a class. What if she'd forgotten how to teach? What if they didn't respect her? But then she spotted Dustin, Pete, and Kevin sitting in the back row. They gave her encouraging thumbs up, and suddenly she wasn't nervous anymore. She was home. Good morning, she said, setting her range bag on the small table at the front of the room. Today we're going to start with the absolute basics. The first rule of firearm safety is this. Treat every gun as if it's loaded, even when you know it isn't. As she spoke, she felt the years fall away. The words came easily, naturally, as if she'd never stopped teaching. She moved around the room with confidence, making eye contact with each student, watching for signs of confusion or understanding. And when she demonstrated the proper stance, the proper grip, the proper sight alignment, Her hands were steady and sure. The tremble that had plagued her on that first day back at the range was gone, replaced by the certainty that came from decades of experience. This was what she was meant to do. This was who she was meant to be. Not just Robert's widow, not just Lisa's mother, not just an old woman living out her quiet days alone. Eleanor Blackwood. Instructor, expert, teacher. As she guided her new students through their first tentative steps into the world of proper marksmanship, Eleanor felt truly alive for the first time in 5 years. And somewhere, she was sure, Robert was watching and smiling. 3 months passed quickly. Summer faded into early autumn, bringing cooler mornings and the first hints of color to the trees. Eleanor's Saturdays at the range became the highlight of her week. What had started as a tentative experiment had grown into a full-fledged second career. The regulars at Ridgeline now greeted her by name when she arrived, often stopping to chat or ask for advice. Her beginners' classes were always full, with a waiting list that stretched 2 weeks out. And her private sessions with Dustin's group had expanded to include several other advanced shooters who wanted to refine their skills under her expert guidance. On this particular Saturday morning, Eleanor arrived at the range earlier than usual. She'd been experimenting with a new teaching approach for her beginners and wanted to set up some special targets before the class arrived. As she pulled into the parking lot, she noticed an unfamiliar van parked near the entrance. A logo on its side read Channel 8 News. Eleanor frowned slightly as she gathered her range bag from the passenger seat. Jim hadn't mentioned anything about reporters. Inside, the range was busier than normal for this early hour. Jim was talking with a woman in a tailored blazer who was holding a small notebook. Nearby, a man adjusted a professional-looking camera on a tripod while another checked sound equipment. Jim spotted Eleanor and waved her over, his face lighting up. "There she is. Mrs. Blackwood, I'd like you to meet Amy Chen from Channel 8. She's doing a story on our range." The reporter turned to Eleanor with a bright smile. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've heard so much about you. Jim tells me you've revolutionized the training program here." Eleanor shot Jim a questioning look. He at least had the grace to appear slightly sheepish. "I may have mentioned how popular your classes have become," he admitted, "and how you've helped us attract a whole new demographic of beginners who might otherwise have been too intimidated to try shooting." "We'd love to include you in our story," Amy said eagerly. "A former FBI instructor coming out of retirement to teach a new generation. It's a wonderful angle." Eleanor hesitated. She'd never been comfortable in the spotlight, had always preferred to stay behind the scenes even during her FBI days. But before she could formulate a polite refusal, the front door opened and Dustin burst in, followed by Pete, Kevin, and 2 other members of their shooting club. "Mrs. B," Dustin called out using the nickname they'd given her over the past months. "Are we still on for 10 o'clock? We've been practicing that breathing technique you showed us last weekend." He stopped short when he noticed the camera equipment. "What's going on?" "Channel 8 is doing a story on the range," Jim explained. "And they're interested in Mrs. Blackwood's classes." Dustin's face lit up. "Oh man, that's perfect. Mrs. B is the best instructor we've ever had. You should see her shoot. It's unbelievable." Amy's interest visibly increased. "Is that so? Would you be willing to demonstrate for our viewers, Mrs. Blackwood?" Eleanor felt trapped. She looked from Jim's hopeful expression to Dustin's enthusiastic one, then to the camera that now seemed pointed in her direction. "I'm not sure that's necessary for your story," she began. "Please," Amy pressed. "It would add so much visual interest. Just a short demonstration." Eleanor glanced at her watch. Her beginner's class wouldn't arrive for another hour. She had the time, but still, the idea of performing for a camera made her uncomfortable. She'd always believed that shooting was about discipline and skill, not showing off. "Mrs. B," Pete said quietly, stepping closer to her. "Remember what you told me when I was nervous about trying for my advanced certification? Sometimes we need to step outside our comfort zones to remind ourselves what we're capable of." Eleanor couldn't help but smile at having her own words quoted back to her. Using my own advice against me is unfair, she said. But there was no heat in her words. I'll tell you what, Jim suggested. Why don't we have Mrs. Blackwood teach her regular class and you can film some of that? Then maybe at the end she can give a quick demonstration if she feels comfortable. It was a reasonable compromise. Eleanor nodded her agreement and Amy seemed pleased with the arrangement. Perfect. We'll set up in the classroom and try to be as unobtrusive as possible, the reporter promised. Eleanor wasn't entirely convinced, but she headed to the classroom to prepare for her class anyway. As she arranged her teaching materials, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of nerves in her stomach. It had been decades since she'd been filmed doing anything. What if she made a mistake? What if her hands trembled? What if she embarrassed herself on local television? She was so absorbed in these worries that she didn't hear the door open. When she looked up, Dustin was standing there, concern on his face. Are you okay, Mrs. B? You seem tense. Eleanor sighed. Just nervous about the camera, I suppose. Dustin leaned against the desk. You know, when you first started teaching us, I was so nervous I could barely load my gun properly. Remember? Eleanor smiled at the memory. Dustin, for all his initial bravado, had been surprisingly uncoordinated during their first formal lesson. You dropped an entire box of ammunition on the floor, she recalled, and you didn't laugh or make me feel stupid. You just said, we all drop things sometimes, and helped me pick them up. Dustin's expression grew serious. You gave me the confidence to keep trying. Now I'm shooting better than I ever have. That's because you've worked hard, Eleanor said. Because you believed I could improve, Dustin corrected. And now it's our turn to believe in you. He straightened up. Just pretend the camera isn't there. Teach the way you always do. We'll be watching from the observation area, cheering you on. The simple pep talk worked wonders. By the time her students began filing in for the beginner's class, Eleanor had regained her composure. She barely noticed the camera as she launched into her lesson on basic firearm safety. Her students, a mix of young and old men and women, seemed more focused than usual, perhaps aware they might end up on television. Eleanor moved among them, with the ease of someone who had found her calling, correcting grips here, adjusting stances there, offering words of encouragement everywhere. Remember, it's not about strength, she told a young woman who was struggling with a revolver similar to Eleanor's own. It's about technique and control. Here, like this. She demonstrated the proper grip, her movements fluid and confident. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor could see Amy watching intently, the cameraman catching every moment. But strangely, the anxiety she'd felt earlier had vanished, replaced by the familiar satisfaction of teaching, of passing on knowledge that had been hers for so long. When the classroom portion ended and they moved to the range itself, Eleanor felt completely in her element. She stood behind her students as they practiced, calling out instructions, making adjustments, celebrating small victories. Well done. Tom, that's much better. Linda, try relaxing your shoulders a bit more. Beautiful grouping, Chen, you're a natural. The 2 hours passed in a blur of focused instruction. Before Eleanor knew it, the class was wrapping up, her students gathering their things and thanking her as they always did. Several lingered, to ask questions about practice techniques or to show her their targets, proud of their improvement. As the last student left, Amy approached with her cameraman. That was amazing to watch, the reporter said sincerely. You have such a natural way with your students. Eleanor felt herself blush slightly at the praise. Teaching is a skill like any other, she said. It improves with practice. Would you be willing to give us that demonstration now? Amy asked. Just a short one to show your expertise? Eleanor looked toward the observation area where Dustin, Pete, Kevin, and the others were watching. They gave her encouraging thumbs up and she found herself nodding. A short demonstration, she agreed. What did you have in mind? Whatever you feel comfortable with, Amy said. Jim mentioned you were quite accomplished in competition shooting. Eleanor considered for a moment, then made her decision. Let me set up a few targets and I'll show you a basic skills routine we used to run at Quantico. With Jim's help, Eleanor arranged 6 targets at varying distances, 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet, 25 feet, 30 feet, and the challenging 50 feet. The final target was small, the kind used for precision shooting rather than standard practice. In the field, agents need to be prepared to shoot accurately under different conditions, Eleanor explained for the camera. This drill helps build those skills. She put on her ear protection and safety glasses, then loaded her revolver, not Robert's .38 Special, which she still used for practice, but a newer model she'd purchased for herself after her first month of teaching. It fit her hand better, had been adjusted to her specific needs. "Ready when you are," the cameraman said. Eleanor nodded and took her position at the firing line. She took a deep breath, centering herself. Then, with a focus and precision that belied her 73 years, she began. The first target, 2 shots, center mass. The second, 2 more equally precise. The third, fourth, and fifth followed in rapid succession. For the final target, the small one at 50 feet, Eleanor paused, adjusted her stance slightly, and fired a single shot that hit dead center. When she lowered her gun, there was complete silence in the range. Then from the observation area, applause broke out. Eleanor turned to see not just Dustin and his friends, but a crowd of range regulars who had gathered to watch, all of them clapping and cheering. "That was incredible," Amy said, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. "How long did you say you've been retired?" "Nearly 20 years, Eleanor replied, carefully unloading her revolver and placing it on the table. "And before that?" "You taught at the FBI Academy?" "For 30 years, Eleanor confirmed. "What made you decide to come back to teaching after all this time?" Amy asked, genuinely curious. Eleanor glanced over at Dustin and his friends, who were now making their way from the observation area to congratulate her personally. "Let's just say I received some unexpected encouragement," she said with a small smile. "Sometimes we need to be reminded of what we're capable of regardless of age." "One last question," Amy said as Dustin and the others approached. "What would you say to other retired professionals who might be hesitant to share their expertise?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "I'd say that knowledge doesn't expire and experience is too valuable to waste. There's always someone who can benefit from what you know, if you're willing to teach them." Later that evening, as Eleanor sat in her living room with a cup of tea, her phone rang. It was Lisa, her daughter. "Mom!" Lisa's voice was excited. "Why didn't you tell me you were going to be on TV? One of my colleagues saw the promo for the evening news and recognized your name." Eleanor laughed softly. "It wasn't planned, dear. A reporter showed up at the range this morning." "Well, I'm recording it," Lisa declared. "Dad would have been so proud." As Eleanor hung up, she looked at the photo of Robert on the mantel. "I think he would," she murmured. "I really think he would." She picked up the business card Jim had given her months ago, the one that had started it all. She'd pinned it to her bulletin board as a reminder of the day her life had changed course. Beside it now hung her official instructor certification from the range, a schedule of her classes, and several thank you cards from grateful students. Not bad for an old woman who had once been mocked at a shooting range, not bad at all.